Thank you for joining us on Sozo Firm Insights. Our topic today is titled The Debt We Refuse to Face: Why Inflation is the Default Solution to America's Fiscal Crisis.
For decades, the United States has steadily accumulated a national debt that is now so large that most Americans struggle to comprehend it. The numbers, tens of trillions of dollars and growing rapidly, have become almost abstract. Politicians speak about the debt in campaign speeches, budget debates, and policy reports, but meaningful structural action rarely follows. The reality is uncomfortable. The United States federal debt is on an unsustainable trajectory. Economists, policymakers, and financial analysts across the political spectrum acknowledge the danger. Yet the political system consistently fails to implement the difficult solutions necessary to reverse the trend. The core reason is simple. Addressing the national debt requires painful decisions that carry enormous political risk. The political incentive to ignore the problem. Every president and every Congress faces the same basic dilemma. Reducing the national debt requires some combination of significant spending cuts, tax increases, structural reforms to entitlement programs, reductions in popular government benefits or subsidies. Each of these options carries immediate political consequences. Constituents resist benefit reductions. Voters oppose tax increases. Interest groups mobilize against cuts to programs they depend upon. Politicians who push aggressively for fiscal austerity frequently find themselves punished at the ballot box. As a result, elected officials often take a safer route, acknowledge the debt rhetorically while postponing meaningful action. The debt becomes a talking point rather than a governing priority. This cycle repeats from administration to administration. The political incentives reward delay, even when delay worsens the problem. Theoretical escape valves for the debt. If the United States refuses to make the difficult fiscal decisions required to stabilize the national debt, then some form of extraordinary solution would have to emerge. In theory, a few dramatic possibilities exist. One possibility would be the discovery of enormous natural resources within U.S. territory, valuable minerals, rare earth elements, energy reserves, or other strategic materials that could generate massive new government revenue streams. Another hypothetical scenario could involve the acquisition of new resources through geopolitical expansion. I'm not advocating such, just providing it as an example. History contains many examples of nations expanding territorially to capture natural wealth, though such actions carry profound ethical, legal, and humanitarian consequences and are inconsistent with modern international norms. A third possibility is technological, large-scale resource extraction beyond Earth. Future mining of asteroids, the Moon, or other celestial bodies could potentially unlock vast quantities of rare metals and energy resources. While this concept is still largely speculative today, it is actively explored in the fields of aerospace engineering and space economics. All three possibilities represent extraordinary developments. They are not impossible, but they are far from guaranteed, and none are likely to arrive soon enough to solve the current fiscal trajectory. Which leads to the far more likely outcome: the default mechanism, inflation. If policymakers refuse to address the national debt through fiscal discipline, history suggests another mechanism will eventually intervene: inflation. Inflation acts as a silent tax on currency holders. When prices rise and the purchasing power of money declines, the real value of existing debt decreases. Governments that owe large sums in nominal currency effectively reduce their debt burden when the value of that currency falls. This dynamic has appeared repeatedly throughout history. Nations struggling with overwhelming debt loads often allow inflation to erode the real value of what they owe. In simple terms, inflation shrinks the debt in real purchasing power terms. If a government owes trillions of dollars in fixed nominal debt, and the value of the currency declines substantially, the burden of that debt becomes easier to carry. From a purely mathematical perspective, inflation becomes the path of least resistance, the hidden tax on the public. While inflation helps governments manage debt burdens, it imposes significant costs on citizens. Savings lose purchasing power. Fixed incomes become less valuable. Wages often lag behind rising prices. The cost of housing, food, healthcare, and energy increases. In effect, inflation shifts the burden of fiscal mismanagement from government balance sheets onto the public. Instead of explicit tax increases or spending cuts, the population experiences a gradual erosion of purchasing power. Because inflation occurs gradually and unevenly, it often faces less political resistance than direct fiscal reforms. For policymakers unwilling to make unpopular decisions, inflation can become an indirect solution. The illusion of stability. In the short term, governments and central banks often attempt to maintain the appearance of stability. Policies may aim to suppress interest rates, stimulate economic growth, or maintain financial market confidence. But these strategies can create what might be described as a fragile equilibrium. If government spending continues to outpace sustainable revenue and debt levels, continue to expand faster than economic growth, the underlying imbalance remains unresolved. This can create what some analysts describe as an economic bubble of expectations, a situation where markets, voters, and policymakers collectively assume that the system will continue functioning as it has in the past. History suggests that such assumptions eventually face correction when fiscal reality returns. When the underlying fiscal imbalance finally asserts itself, the adjustment can be abrupt. Confidence in the currency can weaken. Interest rates may rise rapidly. Investors may demand higher returns to compensate for inflation risk. Government borrowing costs increase. At that point, policymakers face a limited set of options: severe austerity, debt restructuring, or accepting higher inflation. In many historical cases, inflation becomes the chosen, or unavoidable, outcome, the historical pattern. Numerous countries throughout history have experienced similar fiscal trajectories. Governments accumulate large debts during periods of war, economic crisis, or expansive public spending. Political incentives delay correction. Eventually, the system adjusts through inflation, currency devaluation, or both. These monetary corrections can vary in severity. In moderate cases, they gradually reduce the real burden of debt. In extreme cases, they lead to severe inflationary episodes that reshape the entire economic system. The United States benefits from advantages many other countries did not have, including the global reserve status of the US dollar and the size and productivity of its economy. These advantages provide resilience, but they do not eliminate fiscal reality. The Great Monetary Correction. If structural fiscal reform continues to be postponed, the most probable outcome is not a sudden political awakening in Washington. It is a monetary adjustment. Inflation becomes the mechanism that slowly reconciles government obligations with economic reality. The process may take years or even decades, but the direction becomes increasingly difficult to reverse as debt levels grow. For citizens, businesses, non-profit organizations, and institutions, the lesson is straightforward. Fiscal policy decisions made in Washington eventually affect the value of money itself. When governments refuse to confront unsustainable debt directly, the adjustment does not disappear. It simply arrives through the currency. And when that monetary correction finally occurs, it can reshape the economic landscape in ways that political leaders once hoped to avoid.
You've been listening to Sozo Firm Insights. Thank you for joining us.